Okay, welcome everyone to this fabulous event from from the Global Black Caucus and the Global Hispanic Caucus, the Underground Railroad from Texas to Mexico. I think this is going to be very enlightening. But before we begin, I just want to remind everybody that if you vote in California, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Texas, Tennessee, or Virginia, please if you haven't already done so, please request your absentee ballot because we've got some really important elections. And I just want to say, we don't want to let Republicans win anything when we don't have to. So please, and tell your friends and family who live in those states to go ahead and vote because this madness has to stop. So today's webinar is about a lesser known part of history. And again, I just want to thank the Hispanic Caucus and the Black Caucus for putting this together. I'd like to also just quickly introduce the chair of the Hispanic Caucus, Cynthia Romero, and the chair of the Global Black Caucus, Adrian George. But before we get into our presentation from our speaker, let me show a clip from this Discovery Channel show called Dangerous Escapes to Spanish Territory, the Underground Railroad, Secret History. This is something that people can actually watch. I finally found it online just today that I could watch the whole episode. It was really, really good. So here we go.
During the height of American slavery, the El Camino Real de los Tejas, one of the main trade routes between Texas and Mexico, was secretly used by freedom seekers escaping from Louisiana.
This path would have gone all the way towards freedom into Mexico.
In 1804, it was key to an armed resistance by enslaved people ready to fight for their freedom.
The group of slaves from the Natchitoches Parish region got together and decided they were going to make a break for Spanish territory. This happened amongst slaves from at least 6 different plantations. When they started out from the one plantation, as they traveled along and went to the other, then you would hear, letting the people know, hey, it's time to gather, it's time to go.
The organizers of the escape chose to use whistles as a signaling method, allowing people on different plantations to communicate undetected.
One of the biggest things that they did in the planning was to time out when they were going to leave. They left on a Sunday. The slave owners would have been at church, which bought the fugitives more time before they would have even been discovered as missing. At the last stop, they stole horses, they stole guns. That lets me know that they were willing to defend themselves. But right before they could get to Spanish territory, they were caught.
Punishment after recapture was swift and brutal.
They were brought into the town square, laid down, face down, tied up, and then whipped. They said whipped until they were bloody. I have been able to piece together this information based on largely Spanish documents. But to this day, there's still resistance to it.
The National Park Service has spearheaded the use of modern technology to highlight El Camino Real de los Tejas route taken by freedom seekers. This new imagery reinforces Rolanda's research. Now future generations will know the role the paths played in the Underground Railroad and the successes as well as the failures of those who took it in search of freedom.
I just took it on personally that my work would focus on adding the parts that have been left out all along. These are the kind of things I want to talk about so that my nieces and nephews growing up will know what contributions people of African descent made.
The freedom seekers who managed to evade capture and reach the U.S.-Mexico border still had to face one more deadly obstacle, the Rio Grande River.
Crossing the Rio Grande was a very dangerous feat. A lot of individuals often lost their lives trying to cross it.
But some did make it across. In 1936, the Library of Congress slave narrative testimony from Sally Rowe revealed that her father and 3 uncles reportedly crossed the Rio, riding bales of cotton and paddling with sticks.
Keep it to the left.
Got it.
Members of TXAR, a Texas-based search and rescue team, have witnessed firsthand the deadly risks and unseen dangers freedom seekers would have faced crossing into Mexico.
We're never going to win against Mother Nature. The power of the water, it's relentless. It's a hazard that's often underestimated.
Despite its incredible strength today, at one point the Rio Grande was even more menacing.
200 years ago, rivers like the Rio Grande were much more powerful, swift. If someone is swimming across the Rio Grande, the most deceptive part could be on the far shore, closest to freedom. Could be swifter current, could be deeper, as well as current can push you back out to the center, depending on conditions.
The southern routes taken by freedom seekers on the Underground Railroad were often deadly, and many perished crossing the Rio Grande trying to reach Mexico.
200 years ago, this river was so powerful, it would wash riverside ranches away.
But after risking life and limb to avoid capture, some freedom seekers with limited means still managed to survive this final stretch in the treacherous journey. Historian Rosanne Bachagarza is uncovering the complicated truth.
Across the river is Mexico. Where we are standing right now is Texas. During that period of time, slavery was still the law of the land, but freedom could be found just across the river. Steamboats were traveling up and down the river so that they could trade with the ranchers and the farmers in the region.
The trade network between farmers in Texas and Mexico is the perfect cover for an Underground Railroad route.
Freedom seekers also used ferry landings to cross the river to the other side.
And Rosanne has uncovered one Texas family on the border that helped make it happen.
Everybody. So let's all just remember that no matter what the Trump administration does, we have a very broad and interesting history. And Adrian, would you like to introduce Dr. Hammack?
It's an honor and a pleasure. Dr. María Esther Hammack is a Mexican scholar whose work bridges the histories of abolition and Black liberation that shaped North America. She is currently PO of a Mellon Foundation Grant. I'm sorry, Maria, what is that,
Principal investigator.
Co-principal investigator, thank you, of a Mellon Foundation Grant centered on empowering Afro-American, Afro-Indigenous, and Afro-Mexican descendant communities to recover and reclaim their ancestors' stories of liberation. Maria is assistant professor of African American history at The Ohio State University. It's my honor and privilege to hand it over to Dr. Hammack to provide an overview of today's discussion. Welcome and thank you for accepting our invitation.
No, thank you, Adrian. I am thrilled to be here and to be able to share a little bit of the work that I do. So thank you so much for reaching out and inviting me. So I hope you all enjoy. Today, I will briefly discuss some concepts like Mexican abolition, what made that possible, as well as various processes of freedom that connects the United States and Mexico to offer context to the stories of the women that I often highlight. There is an exhibit that we opened not long ago at the Plano African American Museum in Dallas that highlights some of those stories. And I did share my latest publication with Adrian that she can share with all of you on two of the women. In that particular publication centers two women who, like Harriet Tubman, led the Underground Railroad to Mexico. But In the spirit, of these histories, I want to share some of the names of phenomenal women that led the Underground Railroad to Mexico. I'll tell you a little bit about their experiences. And hopefully, through these stories, we can help reckon with the many ways that Black women not only fought for freedom, but how they were consequential actors who helped engineer it. So hopefully we'll add a few, at the end of this presentation, we will all add a few more names alongside Harriet Tubman. So I'll start by telling you briefly about the processes of freedom that shaped early Mexico. Then I will highlight some of the networks that empowered these journeys to Mexico. And I'll conclude with a few stories of these Black women who I situate as freedom fighters. So to begin, I have to clarify that this work and the stories I will share centers a diaspora that I argue began in the 18th century, an African diaspora that shaped Mexico too. That is a second sort of diaspora, so not the first diaspora that shaped Mexico. The first diaspora, as we may or may not know, arrived in 1519 with Hernán Cortés. So Hernán Cortés arrived in Mexico in 1519, and with him, he brought the first African men. And some of them were free, some of them were enslaved. But this colonial history, the colonial period, saw thousands of enslaved people brought to Mexico. So second to Brazil, Mexico received the second largest number of enslaved people from various African nations. So that's the first diaspora. But this particular work that I do centers on the second diaspora of individuals who were enslaved in the United States or in places that were becoming US spaces, that were escaping and running to Mexican spaces. So just to make that clear. And to let you see the context, I have added this for you on here, a sort of a timeline of the legal processes that shape freedom or abolition in Mexican spaces. This is not one that is all the laws, but it's just samples of some of the laws that became very consequential and began to shape freedom in and for early Mexico. This certainly does not mean this is comprehensive, but I hope it gives you a glimpse of the precedents that propelled at least the knowledge and the ideas about freedom in Mexico. This knowledge and ideas that reach people enslaved across US spaces or the quickly transforming spaces that were becoming US spaces, people started understanding that if they could go to Mexican spaces, they could be free. And this is some of the laws that empowered these ideas and knowledges. People enslaved across the continent knew and understood that in Mexican geographies, freedom could be potentially claimed as early as the mid-18th century. And this was truly a process. As you see, a lot of these laws, it took many decades for these processes to consolidate. And although these were not the only precedents, the importance of acknowledging this not only allows us to better understand and interrogate what Mexican freedom was, but also how it materialized at the very many levels that freedom materialized for enslaved people across Mexican spaces. Liberation and abolition initiatives, as you see in the timeline, were procured in Mexican spaces, especially as independence from Spain or from Spanish control was sought and fought for by people in Mexico. As you see, Mexico's independence fight against Spain was a long fight that took over 10 years or took over 10 years to win. But throughout this process, many of the leaders who were pushing to be free from Spain, who came to power in the name of independence, they were very intentional about the abolition of slavery in Mexico. So not only freedom, but also the abolition of slavery was at the forefront for all Mexicans, Black, Indigenous, and Mestizo alike. And sometimes I get asked, but why? Why was this at the forefront for people who were fighting for independence from Spain? And my answer to this is that abolishing slavery was at the forefront because most of the people who were fighting for Mexican independence from Spanish rule were Black, Indigenous, or Afro-Indigenous people who were either born enslaved themselves or their parents were born enslaved or their grandparents were born enslaved. So they had a connection with the institution of slavery because some of their families had been born enslaved. So it was only logical that if they were fighting for this, whatever this country would become, if they were fighting for this Mexico to be free, they also wanted to be free in that new country. And so you see a lot of the leaders that rose up in this period, including Vicente Guerrero, who you see right here, were Afro-Mexican, and they had this vested interest in making sure that in this new nation, slavery would be abolished. So I wanted to showcase a few of these timelines so you can see as soon as Mexico secured independence, but even before. So for instance, I'm going to highlight this law in 1813 with Jose Maria Morelos, who was a Black Mexican priest, who also was one of the leaders that led in the independence movement. He was one of the first to say that slavery, and he said that slavery and everything that smelled of it must be done away from the country, from the continent, not only from Mexico, but from the continent of America. And so that was one of the first decrees issued in his Sentimientos de la Nación. But then after Mexico secured independence, right after that independence was secured, they passed the winners, the people who won and secured independence, who were a lot of Afro-Indigenous, Afro-Mexican, and Mestizo. They passed two consequential laws, and you see them here in 1821 and 1822. The 1821 law said that all inhabitants, without distinction of being Europeans or Africans or Indians, are citizens. So that's one thing that's key, the whole idea of concept of citizenship, with the freedom to pursue their lives according to their own merits and virtues. And then the 1822 law basically said that no government document is to classify citizens by racial origin. And thus, every person living in Mexican territory was henceforth to be considered without distinction a citizen, even on paper. And what these two laws did was directly challenge the casta system that had been established during the colonial period that classified people by racial origin, that put people of African ancestry at the bottom. And so you start seeing like the first two key laws were passed in 1821 and 1822 to get rid of racial classification. And so this also was the work of Afro-Mexican leaders. And so this is sometimes something that is not taught. It's not really taught in Mexico. It's not taught in the United States. But these are very consequential processes that you start seeing shaping the abolition processes or the legal abolition processes that you start taking shape in Mexico, long before these processes took shape in Canada or the United States. So I wanted to show you that just so that you or highlight those few laws because I think they're very consequential. And I do hope that this timeline offers you a visual of some of the precedents that shape freedom for early Mexico, that enable others to come and claim their freedom later. I do like to point out always here that, here in the United States, we're always proud that we had our first Black president, Barack Obama. But, in Mexico, we had two Black presidents before 1860. So we had Vicente Guerrero in 1829, and then we have Juan Alvarez, who was also president in the early 1850s. And of course, Vicente Guerrero was the president who passed the decree that abolished slavery in 1829 in Mexico. And so again, you see Black Mexicans leading this abolition movement for Mexico. And also, it is very important to highlight that, you see a lot of the men in this independence movement, but also Black women were part of these processes. Black women, men, and children began pursuing liberation in early Mexican spaces during this period through these laws, utilizing these laws that you see, or some of these laws and others, to claim their freedom. So they started to hear about freedom in Mexico, and they were reaching Mexican spaces and utilizing these laws to be free. So through the research I've done, I've traced individuals reaching places like early San Antonio, from places like Louisiana, French Louisiana, as early as the 1760s. So these histories really expand, or I hope that the work that I do expands our understanding of the Underground Railroad to situate it to expand our understanding of the timelines, the geographies, and the actors of Black liberation, or that shape Black liberation in North America. And through the research that I've done, what I have learned, particularly conducting primary research in archives across many archives in Mexico, in the US, and Canada, through that work, what I have learned and what I have seen in the records is that Black women were at the forefront of this journey southward, just as much as Black men. Contrary to the history books that tells us often that Black women escape bondage less than men, the records that I have found, particularly in Mexican archives, but also in Canadian archives too, clearly show women. And what I have learned is that when you have found the women, or when I have found the women, I have found the children as well. I have found the men as well. So I have found families. So you find women and you find the families. And as historian Jennifer Morgan argues in her phenomenal work, she says that finding women in history requires a reading that privileges utterances that meant to be small and insignificant. And it requires a reading that rejects the notion that women were passive or unconscious observers of men's radical resistance. So in most ways, I hope that the work that I do helps us search for the women and find the women, because they're in the archives, and so but their stories remain untold or undertold. And so it's important to always have an eye out for where are the women, or at least question what were their roles, right? So this record that I have here on the screen is written in French, but this record documents the pursuit of a Black woman who escaped her French enslaver in Louisiana, and who took her 4-year-old son and made her way to San Antonio to claim her freedom there in the spring of 1789. So it's still in the 18th century. When she endeavored her pursuit to claim freedom on the 20th of May of 1789, she not only took her 4-year-old son, but also took another child who was a 15-year-old boy named Boku, and she names him Boku. It's not clear if Boku was also her child, or maybe could have been a nephew. It's not clear in the record. Sometimes we're piecing things together. But she also ensured that she had provisions for her escape. So it's important to understand that when women escaped, they planned it out. They knew they had to plan what the routes they were going to undertake. They had to take things so that they can survive the journey. This particular woman, who we don't have her name in the record, she took 3 horses. She stole 3 horses from her enslaver and took them with her, and as well as other effects, which demonstrate how carefully she had planned her escape. This particular record that you see on the screen was received in San Antonio in June of 1789, because, of course, the enslaver didn't want to lose her or her son, because to him, she and her son and the 15-year-old boy were valuable property. So he sent this to San Antonio and said, hey, I know they're going there, and I know they're about to reach. I need you to return them to me as soon as as they reach there. However, I do want to point out something, that because this was 1789 and this was June, I want to go back to this one law right here that was passed in 1789. It was still passed by the Spanish, but it was passed for Mexican spaces, but it was still under the colonial rule. But it was a decree that declared that any slave to arrive in early Mexico, or the frontiers spaces, must not be returned to their foreign enslavers. And so this particular woman, that was passed on April 14 of 1789. And so by the time this woman arrived in San Antonio, she could not be returned to her enslaver because of that decree. And so you start seeing how women were able to claim freedom. And so this is just one of the stories that situates women in doing these journeys, physically endeavoring these journeys. And unfortunately, I have not been able to find out exactly what happened to this woman and her son, or her 15-year-old. It is not clear. They disappear once they reach San Antonio. they disappeared, and I don't know if she was able to stay there. The law says that she should not have been returned, but history is complex, so we don't know. But while we don't know what happened to this particular woman, I have been able to find and trace countless others who did make it to early Mexico, particularly to early San Antonio from French Louisiana in this period as well. So not long after, another woman by the name of Marie also escaped her French enslaver in Louisiana. Marie also headed to early Mexico, and she was aiming to reach San Antonio. Also took her son and a couple of daughters, so 3. And she did reach it. She did reach San Antonio and claim her freedom there. And from that space, she started to help others to freedom. Now, when Marie escaped, she took her infant son and her 2 daughters. And unfortunately, they were pursued by her enslaver before they reached San Antonio. But in that pursuit, it's not clear, but the records do show that they were caught momentarily and that her son was taken. Marie did make it to San Antonio, but her son did not. Her son was returned to her former enslaver. Her daughters did also reach San Antonio. They were a little older. And unfortunately, her son was not. But even when she made it to San Antonio, she made it her business to fight for her son's freedom. She reached out to the provincial governor of Texas at the time to help her not get her son for free, but she was trying to negotiate with the provincial governor of San Antonio to help her purchase the freedom of her child from the former enslaver. And the ordeal took several years. So this was 1790 when she escaped and made it to San Antonio, and it took her until 1808 when she was able to finally purchase the freedom of her infant, which by 1808, he was no longer an infant, he was a little older. But she succeeded, and she was able to get her son back a few years later, but by 1808, she got her son back. But that was not it. She made it her business to help others. And her story is truly one that signifies the role that women played. She was unyielding in her fight. And even though it covers several decades, I've been able to find her in the records and find how she consistently fought for others as well. And so she fought for over a decade for her child, but then she continued to fight to bring others, family members, friends that were also enslaved in French Louisiana. And because of her efforts were so powerful, the former enslaver ended up suing her or launching a lawsuit against her with the government of Texas. And in his lawsuit, this enslaver basically said that he claimed that Marie had been actively encouraging others held enslaved by him to abscond, so to escape, and that she was doing this. And he made sure to say, he argued that the whole situation of her enticing the enslaved in his plantation to escape to Texas was too much for him, and that he needed help to make her stop. And in his suit, he actually begged to be assisted because Marie, he says, and I'm quoting him, for many years had been, I'm quoting him, by word of mouth and in writing, perverting all his slaves to run away to where she was. So you start seeing how the roles of women like Marie were unyielding. She was causing decidedly at least financial harm to her former enslaver, because she was helping a lot of the people he held enslaved escape. And so this man, of course, eventually lost the lawsuit, and Marie continued to fight for the freedom of others. She, the provincial governor of Texas did not really do anything with the lawsuit. The guy did lose the lawsuit. But one of the last documents I was able to find that situates Marie in San Antonio was in 1823, when she helped her brother Andres escape her French enslaver and make it to San Antonio with her. But Andres didn't want to stay in San Antonio. He kept going to Guadalajara. So you see Marie helping Andres reach Guadalajara, and that's where he claimed his freedom. He stayed in Guadalajara and joined the army. So you start seeing that a lot of these histories are consequential and really situate the stories of liberation and the struggles and the journeys and the interconnectedness and how Black women continued fighting and helping others, not just themselves, but others as well. And so this story of Marie and the ways in which she, as her former enslaver puts it, corrupted and enticed enslaved people to escape to Mexico, brings me to a key aspect that I have documented and in many ways interrogated through my work. And this aspect is twofold. First, one of the questions that I had was, how did journeys to freedom to Mexico actually materialize? And second, who led these journeys to Mexican spaces? Who was or were part of these networks to freedom, in particular on the southern frontier? And what I found has been both enlightening, but certainly not surprising. The networks of assistance I have documented are quite diverse. A pool of individuals and groups did a lot of the helping. Mexican people were certainly known to assist, both within the US and in Mexican spaces. Sometimes Mexicans were known to be guides to help people across the river. They were also seen here, if you see this record right here in the middle, a group of, I think it was 8 enslaved people arrived in a town of Monclova, and they arrived with nothing but what they were wearing, and most of them were barefoot, and they needed supplies because they didn't want to stay on the borderlands. And I'll tell you a little bit why they didn't want to stay on the borderlands a little bit later. But the Mexican townspeople there, they actually collected right here 246 pesos to help this group so that they could get food and shoes and supplies so that they could continue on their journey, so that they could claim freedom further down the road. And so you start seeing, you do see records where you see, actively Mexicans helping. You also see Native people helping as well, as you see on this particular document here, where a Choctaw man was charged for writing fake passes to people who were crossing certain territory across Texas. And of course, a lot of these records that situate Mexicans and indigenous people helping, you only see when they're actually caught or when something happens that they had to write it down, because these networks were clandestine networks and people didn't want to, didn't want other people to know who was helping. So it's been hard to collect and find out who was helping, but a lot of the records do show Mexicans and indigenous people helping. Now, it is very important to also acknowledge that doing this work has also allowed me to find records that are very lamentable. And because I have found both Mexicans and indigenous people doing the opposite of helping. So I think it's important to situate that and share this with you, because I have found Mexicans working as slave hunters too, and indigenous people actually catching people who were almost to Mexico, and they were catching them and returning them and either selling them back to slavery or selling them back to taking them back to their former enslavers. So it's a complicated history, but what we can take from this is that, yes, there were people that were helping and there were people that were not. But you do see the help and how these networks materialized in many of the ways that they did. We also see white abolitionists doing a lot of the helping. You have Benjamin Lundy, for instance, who actually went to Mexico and tried to get Mexico to offer land grants, particularly to establish colonies. But even in spite of all these networks that I just mentioned, Mexicans and white abolitionists and indigenous people, it is very imperative that we situate it and at least acknowledge or reckon, if you will, that it were Black women, men, and children, enslaved and free, who were leading these networks, who were engineering these networks to freedom to Mexican geographies. Enslaved and free Black people were very active in their own pursuits, the claiming and the fighting for freedom at the very many levels that freedom materialized for them in Mexican geographies. So that's one thing that is important to highlight, that it were Black Americans who were leading these networks as well. And while many were physically endeavoring, engineering these networks by making their way to Mexican spaces by physically endeavoring those routes, creating them and crafting them and planning them. Many Black women, men, and children in the US were also intellectually forging and facilitating the idea or pathways to freedom, at least the idea that in Mexico you could claim freedom. And you start seeing this in many records where you see Black Americans talking about Mexico or saying you should go to Mexico, or in Mexico you could be free. For instance, this is one of the records that I found that it was published in the Liberator, an abolitionist newspaper. It is by an unnamed Black woman. Again, a lot of these individuals will write very powerful essays, but they couldn't put their names on it because it was against the law to advocate for against the institution of slavery, right? To advocate for freedom. And so, but this unnamed Black woman who was a Black abolitionist from Philadelphia, she wrote that for her support for Mexico. So intellectually, she was conceiving and spreading this idea that that was the place that people enslaved needed to go, and enslaved and free. And she says Mexico, she situates Mexico as a freedom destination, and she argued that it was the best place for Black Americans to go. And she wrote, and I'm quoting a little bit from the record since I don't think you can see it very well, it's a little small, but she wrote, "Where is that country to which we may remove and thus become free and equal? I believe that country to be Mexico." So she says that. Mexico, she argues, is an independent nation where the prospects for Black people are far better, whereas in this country, and she's talking about the United States, she wrote, "we are kept poor and of course cannot aspire to anything more than what we have always been." And she goes on and basically makes the case of why we should not think of Canada, we should think of Mexico. And so you start seeing that intellectually she was conceiving that Mexico was the place where people could claim their freedom. So these are some of the ways that these networks were shaped and empowered by Black Americans and by Black women, as you see here. So Black women were at the forefront of these pursuits. And I know I'm going to sound like a broken record by the end of this presentation, but they were leading these pursuits physically and intellectually. And some of these records are only just one or two records I'm showing you, but I've found plenty where you see and you can situate how Black women's role were in these processes. They were leading these mobilities and freedom fighting, not only northward, but decidedly southward, south of US slavery. And I have found plenty of Black women and their freedom fights in all sorts of records in the US and Mexico. And I will turn to I'll tell you about three amazing women, since time is of the essence, that really shaped the Underground Railroad, or what I argue, the Underground Railroads, because there were many pathways that they engineered to Mexican spaces. But three women, and some of which some of you may not know if you read the article that I shared. But I'll tell you about three. But before I do, I'm going to tell you why I'm looking for women in the archives. As an immigrant, I came to this country, as many of us come, without documents. But as soon as I was able to get documentation, I went to school. And I was sitting in a class at East Carolina University. I was living in North Carolina at the time, in this little town called Greenville, North Carolina. And I was sitting in a history class, and we were talking about the Underground Railroad and Harriet Tubman. And I remember I didn't know much about this history, but all I knew was Mexico had abolished slavery in 1829, and it was 30 years before the US. That's all I knew. And so I was sitting in this class and we were talking about Harriet Tubman, and I wanted to know who was the Harriet Tubman who led people to Mexico. So I raised my hand and I asked my professor, and he said, "That's a very good question, Maria. If you find out, let me know." And so I was like, "Wait, but you're the expert. What do you mean? You're the professor. You know everything." And so, but because of that, because he wanted me to find the answers, I went and tried to find the answers and realized that there was a whole lot of things that we don't know and that we're not taught. And based on that one question is what led me on this journey to find the Harriet Tubmans that led people to Mexico. And I have found many, not just one. And so I'll tell you about three. So I'll start with the story of Merle, and this is part of the record that I found in Mexico that talks about, it's a testimony that tells us about Merle. And Merle was a Black woman from Brownsville, or who lived in Brownsville by the 1840s, but who regularly risked her life to assist others. Merle's abolitionary resistance primarily materialized as practices of protest and advocacy. Her modus operandi was to confront Mexican authorities and to hold them accountable for enforcing Mexico's freedom laws. And so it is not widely known if Merle had been enslaved in the US and at some point made it to Mexico, claimed her freedom, and then lived as a free Black woman across that frontier. Sometimes records don't tell us everything. But what we do know is that Merle was a free Black woman living in Brownsville by the time this incident happens, and that she was going back and forth across the Rio Grande helping people. And so the story goes that there was this one family who had been living in Mexico for several years, and this family had escaped slavery from the US, gone to Mexico, and claimed their freedom. The family had escaped US bondage, and after several years on Mexican soil, this family were kidnapped by slave hunters who took them back to the US to return them to their former enslaver. And at this time, former enslavers used to refuse to let their people go, right? They thought they were valuable property, so they would hire people for hire, slave hunters, to go find where they were. Now, remember, in 1850, the fugitive slave law came into effect in the United States, but that did not apply to Mexico. It only applied to the United States. So if they escaped to Mexico, the government was not going to help you bring them back. So you had to pay. So slaveholders had to pay slave hunters, send them into Mexico. And this is what this slave hunter did. He sent a bunch of slave hunters to try to find where this family was because he didn't want to lose them. And so this family were kidnapped. And when the kidnapping happened, Merle was either witness to it or she found out about it. It's not really clear, but she found out about it. And she took matters into her own hands to make this family justice. She went all the way to the town of Reynosa, found the local alcalde, and pressured the Mexican authorities to begin a criminal investigation to find out what happened to that family and to hopefully bring them back to freedom. And she told them about this family. This family were the Hendersons, the Henderson family that consisted of, the wife name was Anna, her husband was Andrew, and they had 4 children, Sybil, Emil, Lyd, and a young son whose name is not in the record. But Merle told the Mexican authorities the family's names, who they were, how long they've been in Mexico free, and what had happened, how they had been kidnapped, and that they needed to go find them. And so because Mexico was, at this point, a place where people were living free, Mexico started an investigation. And Merle actually utilized the laws to prompt the Mexican government to start an investigation to help this family. She basically told the Mexican authorities that, hey, this family had come, and she quoted the law, to the Republic of Mexico. They came searching under the protection of your laws, the liberty they were denied in the United States. So now, because they were here, you should do something to protect them, even when they had been kidnapped. So Merle makes it clear that this family had claimed freedom and had settled in Tamaulipas, and that they were free people in Mexico for many years, and that Mexico had were required to go and do something about it to make them justice. So Merle single-handedly had made freedom, or the freedom of others, her business. And one consequential thing that Merle stressed to local officials in Mexico, when she was pushing for them to begin an investigation into the kidnapping, she stated that the family había venido de los Estados Unidos para librarse de la esclavitud, that the family had come from the United States to Mexico to free themselves from enslavement. Merle's words were very intentional, the language she uses, because it offers us insight how Black Americans understood freedom and liberation processes on their own terms. She made her intellectual conceptions clear through her demands that the kidnapped family had not reached Mexico to seek freedom. They did not just reach Mexico seeking freedom, they came to free themselves from enslavement. She stressed that they had rather reach Mexico para librarse de la esclavitud. And that made a difference, like how that was situated. Ana and her family had not simply gone to Mexico to be granted freedom by the Mexican government. They had to fight for it. They had to fight for everything they got in Mexico too. So in many ways, they were there to free themselves and to fight for their own liberation. And a lot of the times, and this is consequential because a lot of the times we think that freedom is often granted or gifted or bestowed upon to people. Sometimes we think of Abraham Lincoln as the great emancipator. But we have to at least acknowledge that people themselves were fighting for freedom. Always. They had to fight for it. They had to wrestle it. They had to negotiate. And a lot of the times they were fighting for freedom, and many times they were dying to be free. And so it resituates, the language Merle uses really resituates how we understand how people claim freedom, and not that the Mexican authorities were giving them freedom, that they had to fight for everything they had in Mexico too. So the fight was never ending, or as I say, that lucha was ongoing, even when they made it to freedom. As you see, the Henderson family made it to freedom. They were there. They were lived free for many years. And yet that freedom was still fragile because slave hunters could come in and kidnap them. So that's something that's important to acknowledge as well, that freedom was fragile, even in Mexico. It was fragile in the United States North, it was fragile in Canada, and it was definitely fragile in Mexico too. But it should be noted that Merle took enormous risks to do what she did, to go make justice to the Henderson family, who had been kidnapped. Not only did she travel this treacherous territory crossing the borderlands and this river crossing, she also risked the persecution of slave hunters herself and other vigilantes who often roamed those borderlands. Again, think about this. Today we think that, there's still vigilantes, but during that time, they were actively patrolling the borderlands, looking for runaways. So Merle could have been caught in any of these crossings and labeled a runaway herself, and she would have been right back under U.S. bondage if she had been caught. And this was also right after the Fugitive Slave Law was passed in 1850. So Merle was also risking being caught and charged by U.S. authorities for aiding and abetting enslaved people. But she was fearless, and she still that did not deter her from helping and advocating for the Henderson family. And so like Merle, and I have two other women, I think we're good on time, I believe. But I do want to tell you about two other women. The other woman was Matilda Hens. And her story is also quite powerful because Matilda had escaped. She found out she was pregnant, and she escaped her U.S. enslaver in Louisiana. It is not clear how she made it to northern Mexico, but by 1850, she was living in Tamaulipas, in Reynosa, outside of Reynosa, in a little community outside of Reynosa. Now, she had been there for many years, just like the Henderson family. She had been there for many years. And of course, her enslaver refused to lose her. So her enslaver also hired slave hunters to go scope the northern towns in Mexico and try to find and locate where Matilda had gone. And so this group of slave hunters went across a lot of the towns And at some point in the summer of 1850, they found where Matilda was living in her home and living free. And so they returned to the US, told the enslaver where she lived, and the enslaver in August of 1850 decided to cross the border, mind you, illegally cross into Mexico to go kidnap her from her home. And so the records that we have, and you see this record right here, is Matilda left her witness testimony because, and we know about what happened because she tells us exactly what happened. So she tells us that on August 20th of 1850, her former enslaver broke into her home in Reynosa. And that when he was in the middle of the night too. And when he broke into her home, he tried to take her, and the other slave hunter took her daughter. But then as soon as he tried to take her, she started fighting with everything that she had. She started beating him with her hands. She started yelling to the top of her lungs for help, and help did come. Her neighbors woke up. They came to help her, and one of them showed up with guns. And together, one of the neighbors that had the gun and her were able to stop her former enslaver from taking her back to the United States. So together, this man, the neighbor with the gun, and her took that former enslaver to the local jail where she was part of, she took him there and he was lodged in jail, and he remained there for about 10 months without a trial. But we know exactly what happened because they took her testimony, and she tells us everything that transpired, how much she fought, how much she beat him. And Matilda stayed in Mexico free. She never returned to U.S. slavery. Her daughter, who had been taken by the slave hunter, was able to, the townspeople in the next town were able to stop that slave hunter and return her daughter to her. Her daughter name was Harriet Ann. And so this is just a story that is so powerful because you see that Black women, even when they had already claimed their freedom, because Matilda had arrived in Mexico many years before and had already been free, living free. She had her home, she had a job. And yet, even when she had been free for many years, she still had to fight again and literally fight to not be kidnapped and be taken back to U.S. slavery. So this is some of the feats that Black women had to endeavor. And we know about Matilda because she left her testimony. And it was just wonderful to find records so full of her voice. And so I wanted to show you the story. And the last woman, and I have a biography on this woman, SILVIA Hector Weber, who was another woman who, like Harriet Tubman, continued assisting people to freedom through her ferry. She was born and enslaved in Louisiana. She was separated from her mother when she was 8 years old, and she was sold away. She was brought to Mexican Texas by an Anglo settler, but she never stopped fighting for her freedom. In 1834, she secured not only her freedom, but the freedom of her 3 children. And in freedom, to continue helping people to freedom. And she had a ferry when she lived in Central Texas right here. So she was part of a community. She settled in a community that is today 16 miles southeast of present-day Austin, Texas. And from there, she would harbor people in her ranch and ferry them to freedom along the Colorado River right here. I know there's 2 Colorado rivers. One is the Grand Canyon, but there's another Colorado River in Texas. And she would ferry them down this road, down into the Gulf, and then ferry them across to Mexico. In the 1850s, because of the violence in Texas and free Black people were not allowed, they were very limited if they lived in Texas, if they were free. They ended up being pushed out and they moved to the border right here. They actually moved from Central Texas in 1851, I believe, and they moved all the way to Tamaulipas. At some point, they bought a ranch on the river edge, and from there they continued helping and harboring people. Of course, this became a problem by the outbreak of the Civil War. The family, SILVIA and her family, were labeled Unionists because they were ferrying people to freedom. They were labeled anti-slavery advocates, and the Confederacy were persecuting them. She ends up leaving and going back to her home. They had bought a home in Tamaulipas, and two of her sons and her husband were fighting for the Union. And at one point, I found records where her two sons were caught by the Confederacy as they were running secret correspondence to the Union. But they managed to escape. Her sons escaped and they lived through the Civil War. But her stories is phenomenal. And it is one of those stories that I argue should be known. When we learn about Harriet Tubman, we should learn about Sylvia Hector and all that she did. And so I encourage you to learn about her. I have a biography published that I can share with Adrienne so she can share with all of you. There's also, because I wrote the first biography on Sylvia, and as a researcher, I found her Freedom Papers. Because I found the Freedom Papers and they were published, I was able to connect with her descendants. And her descendants today have gotten together and organized a nonprofit to help recover more of her story, to help recover and connect the descendants, because a lot of descendants, when she went to Mexico, some of her children stayed in Mexico, even though she did return back to Texas after the Civil War. But there's a lot of descendants that have not met each other to this day. And so they're trying to recover and connect. And of course, make sure that her history is better known. So I encourage you to learn more, and I'll share more of that information with you. But in closing, I will leave you with two closing thoughts. The first is that what I've learned through the work that I've been doing is that Black women, men, and children were always crafting, claiming, and engineering freedom, and that they always had to fight for it. Always. And often they had to die for it. They died for it. There's thousands of records that I have found of countless of people either being caught as they were crossing the Rio Grande River and returned to their enslavers, or dying. They had died trying to cross that river. And so it's important to recognize even those that didn't make it, their stories still matter. And we still should know their names and their stories of how they tried to make it to freedom in Mexico. And this is consequential because it helps to acknowledge this. It helps us shift our knowledge that freedom, was never granted or gifted, as I mentioned earlier, that freedom was always fought for. And the second thing is that I hope that these stories, these are all our collective stories, right? These bridge our collective past, the US, Mexico, and Canada, for that matter. And so it's important that to reclaim how foundational these are to better understand freedom, liberation, justice, and perhaps the present that we're all living today, that we're all facing with the problems at the border today, right? Children being in cages, people escaping, trying to find better lives and being, persecuted. I think that these stories have the power to help us all challenge not only the erasure that these histories have suffered, that these women have suffered, but also to challenge anti-Blackness and racism, anti-immigrant sentiment, and many other forms of discrimination. Discrimination and anti-Blackness that I've seen not only in the US. This is not a US problem. It's also a Mexican problem, and it's also a Canadian problem. And so if we civilize the stories, I hope, it is my hope, we're able to help bridge and build better futures for all of us across maybe the continent, maybe globally. So that's all I have. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoyed. I look forward to your questions.
Wow. Yeah, that was really amazing. Really, really amazing. I have to say that this topic, once I saw the clip and I decided to do some research to find some different things, it's very fascinating, and it's really is a lesser known part of our history. I think that, yeah, I think that we all need to learn this sort of stuff. And I have a question before we go to the questions in the Q&A. Um, is it possible? Okay, not possible. Is that why Mexico seceded? I mean, Texas seceded from Mexico to be like an independent nation because of slavery?
Yeah, so Mexico was very much on its way to abolish slavery as early as, and I'll put back the So they abolished slavery in 1829, but they had also abolished the international slave trade. They reissued the slavery clause again in 1837 because of the Anglo settlers who, I mean, Mexico passed the law in 1829, but these settlers, Anglo settlers who were moving to Texas, to Mexican Texas, they actually kept bringing slaves. And Mexico was like, dude, we've abolished slavery. You can't bring them. So they started finding loopways to the laws. So they were making people sign 90-year indenture contracts, like, oh no, they're not slaves, they're servants for 90 years. And so they were showing these records to the Mexican government saying, oh, they're not slaves, they're just servants for 90 years. And Mexico was like, no, this is not. So they reissued the law, the abolition law in 1837, as a way of, because the revolution happened in 1836. And they rebelled because Mexico was very much like, no, we're abolishing slavery. And the Texas slaveholders did not want that because they kept sending letters to Mexico saying Texas could not prosper without slavery. And Mexico was like, yes, it can. You're reestablishing slavery, but we don't want that. And so the revolution happened because they wanted to fight for their right to continue slavery in Texas. You see the break, and Mexico never recognizes the Texas Revolution as, or the Republic of Texas as a republic, and they were like, well, they're just a rebellious state, and but they reissued the 1837 by saying something like, well, we had been considerate of you, especially after 1829, we had work with you, but now we're not willing to work with you anymore. We're abolishing slavery and you cannot bring in any more enslaved people. So the break is because of the issue of slavery.
Yeah, so when we remember the Alamo, we should remember it was because of slavery and
Yes.
not because they were just a bunch of heroic guys fighting for some unknown reason.
Well,
Yeah,
they were fighting for the liberty to keep slavery.
yeah,
So,
they were fighting for some bullshit. All right,
yes.
that's great. Yeah, all right. Um, there's a question, a quick question in the chat. Could this be one of the reasons for Anglo animosity towards Mexico? Because they got rid of slavery.
I argue yes. And the Alamo was a Mexican victory. So remember, the Alamo is like, Mexico won the battle.
Yes.
Mexico ended up losing Texas, but Mexico stayed, their resolve to abolish slavery continued. So
Yeah, okay. All right. Let's take some questions from the Q&A. Cynthia, do you want to pick a few out of the
Of,
Q&A?
of course. Thank you so much for the presentation. I think it's very important to say that it's very nice to see how we're always talking about Latinas as having this very strong background, and it also comes from our Afro background. It doesn't just it came. There's a reason why Latinas are considered strong. Those of us who have this Afro background, who have been fighting all our lives for something, and maybe something that in a lot of us we still feel this need to. We're always fighting or trying to prove ourselves. It comes. It's still in our DNA, if you will. We're always fighting for some. So I think it's very important that you highlighted these women and you highlighted the role that women play. We're not just saying we have a matriarchal society just for the heck of it. There's a reason for it, and it's very much buried in. Right now, I think it's buried in our DNA. And I'm thinking about how my family has always reacted and acted. And with your presentation, I'm quite certain that it's there, buried in there. So thank you so much for that presentation. And now I'm gonna look at some of the questions that came up in the Q&A. So one of the things was someone wanted to know what degree were the French slave owners, and to what degree, what did they play? What was their role in French slave owners, and what was the role of the French in the freedom process? Because as we know, we had colonizers from many parts of the world. And so
yeah.
what was their role in this?
The French were also slaveholders. That was one of their roles, particularly in Louisiana. There were a lot of French individuals. And Louisiana was very interesting because Louisiana was held by several flags, if you will. So they were held by the British. They were held by the French first, then the British, then the Spanish for a long time. And then there was a time where it was like they didn't know who, the Spanish held the power, but then there were a lot of meddling. The British were meddling and the French were meddling. But because of this different powers vying for control of in Louisiana, that caused a lot of disruptions that empowered people to just escape and like pit one imperial power against the other. But the French, you do see them being slaveholders and siding with the institution of slavery, particularly in Louisiana. A lot of the records that I found of people that made it to San Antonio, for instance, but also to Monterrey for that matter, had escaped French enslavers in Louisiana. Some of them escape English, but this is also a frontier that if we, I did give you like almost 100 years of history here, but a lot of transitions happened in this borderlands where a lot of powers came into power and left, right? So there was always this changing in dynamics, but you do see the French as being slaveholders. They were the ones who established the Code Noir, or the Black Codes, in Louisiana before the British came, before the Spanish came. And so you start seeing that. Another thing that I found, and this may be relevant if we're talking about European powers, often we think that Germans who came to places like Texas or, across the South, that they were abolitionists because, sometimes we create this idea that Germans were abolitionists. But in the stories that I've found, particularly in Texas, a lot of the Germans that I have found were not abolitionists. They were actually pro-slavery. And a lot of them on the borderlands were catching people and returning them to their enslavers. So it made me question this idea that I had that Germans were abolitionists. For some reason, that's what I thought. But, come to find out that it's complex too.
Thank you for that. And I think it's very important also to you're saying, we have this notion that some groups were abolitionists or not. And even within our own groups, we have this idea, we were selling our own flesh and blood back. And it's kind of something, and the reason I want to highlight this is because it's something that happens in the United States with the Hispanic community, where someone who has already been established has gained their, my green card, and I'm a passport holder, and all of a sudden someone else comes in, and we are saying, maybe we want to offer these people better health care. And then we're saying no, because I had to go through all the hard work. And it's kind of the same thing. We are still playing out the same problems. We're combating that. And so knowing our history helps us to stop doing that and making sure that we actually help each other. Now I'm going to go, I put in my 2 cents. I'm asking you another question. Someone's asking about, and I'm assuming this is an ID, was the Real Cédula of 1789 issued from Spain as a colonial metropolis, or was it issued by the colonial government in early Mexico? So I have a feeling
No, it was actually by the King of Spain himself. And it was actually, this is another way, and you'll have to read the book more for it when it comes out. But this particular cédula is consequential because it was prompted by a Black woman in the Caribbean who fought for her freedom, and she actually petitioned that her petition be read by the king. And so when it reached the king said, okay, I'm going to give her freedom, but not just that. Because of what she's telling me, I'm going to issue this decree that anyone who reaches my dominions, including what was like New Spain, Mexico, must not be returned to their foreign enslavers. So it's consequential because it was propelled by a Black woman too. Even though she was in the Caribbean, she never made it to Mexico, but her fight was so consequential that it shaped early freedom in early Mexico too.
Very good. That's actually quite interesting. And I think this question actually also follows up. So why do you think Spain would issue a decree about freedom for slaves from foreign owners, but would still keep slavery legal in the Spanish Empire? Why would they do that?
I would say that a lot of the policies and laws that the colonial imperial powers ever made were not necessarily benevolent or because they believed in abolishing slavery or believed in, it was political. They found, they passed these laws. I'm sure he was compelled by the story of this woman who sent him a petition, but I think it was all political. And so a lot of these powers were trying to find ways to hit the other power. And so this is why a lot of the laws sometimes were contradicting, because It was just for political reasons that they passed these laws. And a lot of the times these laws were beneficial for people that were enslaved because they could utilize them, even in spite that they were contradictory.
Let me see here. Thank you so much for that answer. And that actually does make sense. That's kind of how we continue to do things right here.
Yes.
So let's see. The next question is, I think this is perhaps the last question we have. Oh no, we have a question about, let's switch it up a bit. What role did the Dutch play in that region where they were often the middleman in slave trade and a lot of it activity in Brazil?
Can you repeat that again? Sorry.
What role did the Dutch play in the region? Because they were often the middlemen in the slave trade, and they had a lot of activity in Brazil.
So the Dutch have a lot of influence in the transatlantic slave trade, and they were powers in that. And they clearly shaped how the first, I talked about the first diaspora that shaped Mexico, the colonial period where the transatlantic slave trade was really sending, thousands of people across the Atlantic and into Mexico. So Brazil had the largest number than Mexico. And, the numbers are actually very small that went to British North America. But in the Mexican context, particularly in this second diaspora that I talk about, the Dutch don't really make it into the stories. I haven't found them much invested into this in the primary records. As slave traders, yes, but by this time, the mid 18th century, they don't play a large role in the stories that I'm looking at.
Thank you for that. Let's see. A lot of questions. This is actually very nice. Well, I think you already answered this, but I don't know if you want to go into more detail. Did Spain play any part in this? And what did they do? Or did they just let the Mexican government kind of just do whatever they wanted? And I think you already answered there was the political aspect, but if you want to go into more detail, please.
Well, once Mexico secured independence, Spain was out. And this new regime that came into power, like a lot of the leaders of independence, as I mentioned, were either Black or Indigenous or Afro-Mexican, right? And they, like Vicente Guerrero, he fought in the independence movement. Jose Maria Morelos fought also in the independence movement. So once they secured independence and they got rid of Spain, it was only logical that they wanted to be free and to make sure that their descendants live free in this new place, whatever it looked like. As remember, for 1 year we were an empire, right? And then we became a republic. So but freedom was always, even when Agustín de Iturbide established the first empire, the laws that he passed, like the 1821 and 1822 laws, were under the empire. So they still were propelling freedom, right? They were trying to cast away the casta system. And so you see it even when Mexico struggled, because if you see it, Mexico struggled for the first, most of the 19th century, but you can see that freedom was always, or at least the abolition of chattel slavery was at the forefront.
So thank you so much for that. I think it's very interesting how we're talking about the regaining of the power of the people, but we're also talking about the regaining of the indigenous power, where we're talking, people always say Aztec, and then we have so much and it's so beautiful. And the fact that we're regaining that, we're becoming proud of that. It's so important. And you brought up those points that this was the color of our skin and our background and our languages, they're all coming back. And we're not only breaking free from slavery, as in someone holding us, but the enslavement of our cultures, it's happening all around. And we're regaining Quechua back in the South. It's amazing. So I think it's very great. I have one last question here, and it's tying into what's happening currently. So It says that the present administration is attacking history at all levels of society, which we have experienced, unfortunately. So what do you think is a way that we can fight back and to remove, to fight back the whitewashing of our history, because that's what we're discussing, and especially when it deals with the history of our indigenous people and the history of slavery, and then also the interconnectedness of those. I'm going to add to the question.
Yeah, no, it's very important to challenge the erasures. I do think that by recentering the stories, particularly of Black women who often are not, represented, but also whose records, of whose voices often are not recovered, right? Sometimes they didn't leave records. But in the Mexican archives, there's a lot of records, and I've been able to find the voices of the women as some of the records that I showed you on primary sources. I do think it's a matter of who's writing these histories and why they haven't been written before. When I went to the Mexican archives, a lot of these records, they've been there for what, 200 years, 300 years, right? Since the archive established and at some point. But they have been there for at least a century. I've noticed that other scholars have looked at the same records, but they've written about others, or they've written about the men, or they've written about the environment, but they use the same records. But why haven't they written about the women? It's my question. This book or this work could have been done 100 years ago, but I think it's a matter of perspective. Or what do we prioritize? It also could be, why have these histories not been prioritized? Could be a matter of, a lot of us have been in these spaces before, have not been in these spaces before. Women of color, Black women, have not been in these spaces where we can reframe and prioritize these histories. It's changing now. Academia is becoming better. It's more diverse, more inclusive, but yet we're facing what we're facing now. I don't know how much I can add to it, but we all know what we're facing, down to legislations. I live in Ohio, but I've also lived in Texas. Legislation limiting what we can teach. A lot of us are seeing or facing in the next couple of years laws that may not allow us to teach what I just shared with you.
And then, it's
that's
interesting
detrimental.
because that's what right now, there are four of us, as Angela pointed out earlier, four of us, brown women with different backgrounds and different experiences, and we're leading this discussion. And so now I'm going to ask the last question. Someone is saying, just like we are doing this, maybe it's a very short amount of time, but there's a lot of information has gone out. What resources can you provide, or can you point people out that are available for teachers so that they can actually share this history before we're not allowed to do it, and hopefully stop it from not being allowed to be done?
There's a lot of wonderful resources, and I just saw someone post Dinah Barry. That was my dissertation, my doctoral advisor. She's everything I learn comes from her. And so learning, reading, empowering ourselves with the work of the phenomenal Black and brown women who are leading these histories, who are trying to change things. I think that what you're doing right now is important. That's what matters. Getting the stories out, getting people interested, and knowing, like, for instance, this whole idea of citizenship, and I mentioned that, like, as early as 1821, citizenship was on the table for Mexicans, even if they were Black, Indigenous, or Afro-Indigenous. And if you see in the United States, citizenship was not on the table, especially 1857 with the Dred Scott case. Citizenship for Black Americans was not on the table. But in Mexico, it's a different story. So one of the questions I've always had was like, why, when we learn about the Underground Railroad or when we learn about Black liberation, do we think of Canada, but we don't think of Mexico? Why aren't we taught that Mexico abolished slavery 30 years before the United States and 4 years before Canada? We think that Canadian destinations were, but I've lived in Canada and I did some research. In order to understand the Underground Railroad to Mexico, I had to understand the Underground Railroad in Canada and how descendants, and so I talked to descendants in Canada. I spent a year there and come to find out that, everything wasn't, people, when they arrived in Canada, it wasn't happily ever after. Descendants there today are continue to struggle. They continue trying to fight the narratives and challenging the erasures. And so it's a story that connects us, this erasure. And I think that collectively, if we join forces and learn about the stories, we can help change. We can help bring real change. It's all about collaboration and connecting and working together. I know that's very like
No, it's not,
idealistic,
because
but
someone wrote in the chat right now, said, please, ladies, do not let someone stop you from talking about these topics. So it's obviously it's hitting a nerve somewhere, someone. I would like to thank you on my behalf and on the behalf of the Global Hispanic Caucus for coming here, for doing this presentation, for speaking our beautiful Spanish language without changing the accent and just throwing it out there, because I love that. And I'm going to hand it over to Adrienne to go ahead and talk. And really, thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
See, Cynthia and Angela and everyone, didn't I tell you you love Maria? I saw this documentary, excuse me, on Swedish TV the next day.
Oh.
I said, Angela, we've got to do this. So thank you, Maria, for making me look good, saying I can make this happen, for showing up, for bringing your magic. I could ask a lot more questions, but I want to make sure. I think, Angela, did you share that PDF somehow in the chat?
I
Okay.
did. But I can share it one more time so everybody has it. It'll also be included with the video, so people can get it.
And I wanted to ask Maria to share the
sorry.
title of your book. No, Dr. Hammack, if you could share the title of your book in the chat and remind us, is it out now or it's upcoming?
It's not out yet. It's going to be out in the next year and a half. So I'm working with the press. I'm working with Penn Press, and so I'm in the workings with that. It's going to be called titled Channels of Liberation. The second title is not yet set in stone, but it's Black Women, Mexican Freedom in the Age of Abolitions.
Okay, let's get a groundswell going now.
That's great to know.
But as soon as it's out, I will let you guys know and send you copies. So
well, and come back and talk to us about it for sure.
Would love to.
Yeah, that was a question that somebody asked, where could they buy this book? But you can't buy it because it's not out yet, but it will be. So set a Google alert for it and be ready.
I did want to mention, and Adrienne, that clip comes from a larger documentary, and there's another section where I actually talk about in length about a Black woman who is helping people who are hiding in caves in North Texas. So I think it's in the second, because there's like four sections. So there's more to that if you're interested in learning more about the story of a woman named Lizzie.
All are. Lizzie, I think we all are. Thank you. And do you know where we can find the full documentary? Angela, did you mention you found the full? Because I think we want to watch it all.
It's on HBO Max in the States. I don't know if it's in Europe, but it's in HBO Max. I do know that.
Let me find this link really quickly that I
can I ask
that
you,
I found.
You mentioned who your academic mentor was. You mentioned an ECU at Eastern Carolina.
East Carolina
you
University.
Asked that question. Have you kept in touch with that professor? Do they know what you have done?
Yes, I see him every year at a conference at the Association of African American Life and History Conference. And I also keep in touch with my dissertation advisor, Dinah Berry. She continues to be my mentor, and she's been absolutely wonderful.
Well, you've inspired me and hopefully other people. What can amateur historians like us do to make sure these stories, because I tell you, I'm not going to say how old I am, but I'm old enough that I should have known about what we learned today. How do we encourage? Because, yeah, you were told to go to the library. Is that okay advice to give people now in this internet age? Is there reliable information that you can find without having academic credentials to the real good databases?
I think there's a lot of information online, but also a lot of records that you can see online, a lot of digitized collections. And so I encourage people but the first thing I would encourage students is to ask questions. Many of us who are educators, and I think all of you are educators, you're trying to share these stories. I think that we can do this, have conversations and share stories, but also encourage younger people to be interested. I think if younger people are interested, they'll be more prone to learn and then to try to change things. They are the future, right? They're going to be leading our world. So if they are knowledgeable and they know these stories, maybe they'll get the tools that will empower them to bring meaningful change.
Angela, can I say one more thing?
Sure.
I love one of these things that I loved about the documentary is as our descendants being referred to as freedom seekers. The saddest thing about this documentary is now in 2025, I feel like I'm still a freedom seeker. And you mentioned how these women are through their advocacy, and there was a couple of things, and I was like, "You're talking about us. That's what we're doing."
Yes.
Yes. So thank you for just all of that. It's an epiphany. It's sad. It's empowering at the same time. It's mind blowing. It's inspirational. I don't know. I just had to put that out there because how can this still be happening? How can this still be? And is it true? I'm going to butcher a paraphrase from Coretta Scott King, but I think it was she who said, "Every generation we have to fight for this." So, just real quickly, the second diaspora is what you work on, but did you see other people still fighting to keep this going? And we're just going to keep fighting.
Even before, so and I think I mentioned, I do understand freedom seeking, but freedom seeking is very cyclical. I pay attention to language a lot. And there's this one scholar that also pay attention to language, which inspired me. Her name is LaRoche, Dr. LaRoche. What's her first name? It's escaping me, but she also writes about the Underground Railroad in Black communities on the Ohio River Cheryl LaRoche. And so language is important. So when I was learning about freedom seeking, seeking means cyclical. It's like something that you're looking for, but you may never find, but you're looking and looking and looking. But what I see the records telling me is that Black women were fighting. They were freedom fighters, and they continued to fight, but they were not just seeking freedom. They were seeking and claiming it. They were fighting for it. They had to fight for it sometimes twice, So I see them as they were freedom fighters. And to this day, Black women are freedom fighters, and they continue to fight for liberation in many ways, because we're still fighting for liberation in some way or another. But during slavery times, they were freedom fighters. So I try to say that, like, beyond freedom seekers, they were freedom fighters, and we have to acknowledge them as that. And, I think it's important. The language that we utilize is important. For instance, a lot of scholarship calls people runaways or fugitives, but that's also the language of the institution of slavery. Because the institution of slavery had laws that made slavery illegal, it was illegal to be free. So I try to stay away from calling people fugitives or refugees or even runaways, because they were fighting for their right to be free. And that is like, today we have that conversation. Immigration. There's a lot of things that are illegal today, but it's because of the laws. But if who makes the laws? And are people really illegal? So it's the language matters. And I think, sometimes visualizing how language has power could help us to, in some way, have better conversations, and maybe legislatures in the future can change laws. Slavery was legal in the United States until 1865, but before it was legal. So the laws can change too. Even though when slavery was legal didn't mean that it was right.
Yes, that's right. Many, many, many things that are illegal or have been illegal are morally wrong. And we all need to fight against that. And we need to preserve our real history of the United States, of the world, because I think if people actually knew their real history, that we wouldn't be having as many problems as we have about the past and what it was like, because the past wasn't anything like what they tell you it was like. It's like they're just wish casting. So with that, I just want to say thank you so much, Dr. Hammack. Maria,
Thank you.
I know. I just can't help myself. Whenever I have a woman who has a title, I feel like I need to use it because it's very important. Um, Thank you so much, Cynthia. Thank you so much, Adrian.
Angela, can you
Thank.
just please remind those states that need to vote,
Oh
please?
yeah, no problem. I was actually going to get to that. No worries. I am persistent in my get out the vote message. Please, 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 if you are in one of the states that California, New Jersey, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Texas, Tennessee that have important elections, Texas and Tennessee have House of Representative elections. Uh, please vote. And this is my plea for people in Ohio or who vote in Ohio, or you know people who vote in Ohio, and especially if you're in come from Cincinnati, where I'm from. JD Vance's brother is running for mayor of Cincinnati. We
Oh my God.
cannot let this happen. It can't happen. In fact, JD Vance is from Middletown, which is about 20 miles away from Cincinnati, and I was horrified to see that he now has a home there. So perhaps we can drive him and his brother out of Cincinnati, Ohio, and back to Nowheresville. So I'm going to put the information about voting back in the chat. And thank you all for joining us today. And we hope you will join us for our next events that are coming up. Next week, we're having one of the chair of the Democratic Socialist of New York, who's going to come on and talk about the Mondani election and what they did to make that possible. So thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of your day wherever you are.
I'm going to share before we close, the biography of Sylvia HECTOR, so that you can read it too and learn more about the story. And just give me 1 second before we log off. That way you
All right.
can.
Yeah, I can also include it in the notes to everybody on the way back when I send it out. Yeah, that would be very interesting. I think maybe we should do something for Black History Month about her.
And here we go. And I also want to say I truly appreciate this invitation. Thank you so much for bringing me and letting me share some of the work that I do.
You're so very welcome. You're so very welcome. This was a great presentation. All right, everybody. Have a great rest of your day, and we will see you in the future.
Thank you.
Bye.